Hi everyone, so in this video let's work on building a quizzing program. So this program is going to utilize a dictionary in order to implement it. And so basically the idea behind it is the program should load in questions and answers from a file. So there's going to be a file that has questions and answers in it. It should load those questions in, and then basically it should quiz the user with a certain number of questions, and then actually keep track of if the user got a question right or wrong, or really keeping track of just the total tally of the number that the student has gotten correct. And then at the end, based on that number, the program can spit out a score for the user. So that's kind of the goal. But this is going to utilize a dictionary, which is a subject I covered in the previous video. So what is the format of the file for loading in the questions? So this is an example of a questions file. Basically, the way that it should be formatted is there should be a question, and then it should be separated from the answer by 3 vertical bars. So that's kind of the format that you should anticipate this reading in, and you're going to have to process this, and the way that you're going to want to process this is you're going to take what's in that file, and we're going to want to load it into a dictionary where the keys are the questions. And it's totally fine to have a long string as the key in a dictionary. And then the answers can also be represented as just strings, but those should be the values. So basically, if this was your questions file, that's what you should, the structure of your dictionary that you should have when you load it in. So here's another example with more questions and answers, and they're kind of Python programming related questions. So we can test with this after we implement the program, or even as we go throughout the program. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go and copy this, and we can create a file, and I can save it, and we'll call it questions.txt, and save that. So then when we get to actually working on the code, we can test using those questions, right? So here's an example of what approximately one run of the program should look like. So the program should start, and it should load, or first it should ask the user how many questions do you want to be quizzed on, and then it should ask what's the name of the file to load in with the questions. And then it should basically pick 4 random questions to ask the user. And then it should tell for each question whether the user got it correct or incorrect. And then based on the number of correct out of the total, should give a final score for the quiz. So what are we going to do? Well, we should structure this code into basically 4 different functions. Of course, we should always have a main, right? And we're going to have a function to load the questions from a file. We're going to have a function to get a random question, because we want to be able to choose random questions from our dictionary. And then we're going to have a function for actually asking the question and then returning true or false based on whether the user got the answer right or wrong. So that's the structure. And keep in mind, when you go to work on a programming assignment, one thing that you can do is go read the spec thoroughly, maybe even read it twice, go slowly through it. And then one thing you can attempt to do is you can attempt to say, all right, what kind of functions do I think I might need for this? And if you want, you can actually build yourself basically kind of a code outline for the programming assignment. You can say, well, I'm going to need a main, but I may also need a function that calculates this, or I may need a function that loads in this file, or I may need a function that does this, and build yourself an outline, and then start kind of filling in the code from there. Just one possible strategy. So anyway, I want you to determine a correct implementation for the load function. So remember, the format should look approximately something like that of the file, or this. So keep in mind that format, and you want to load it into a dictionary with this format. So this function, and if you want to take a screenshot of this, you can. But the function itself should basically load the questions from a file. It should already be provided a file name as the parameter, so open up that file, load in the lines, and then it should return, I believe it should be returning a dictionary with all the questions loaded. So we create an empty dictionary initially that will eventually store the questions and the answers. We open up the file, and then we have a loop to go through the lines of the file. Now for each of those lines, of course, we need to do some processing. So we're going to want to split on those 3 vertical bars, and we're going to get each component. So the question should be come before the vertical bars, and the answer should be after. Or I guess for you guys, I need to say after and before. And then we basically, this is how we can put a question-answer pair into the dictionary. We say question, or QA, the name of the dictionary, and then put the key in there, which would be the question, and set that equal to answer, and that would add it into the dictionary. So if we go through and do that processing for every line, at the end, we just return that. And presumably, we're probably going to call this from main eventually, right? But we just need a function that can load in that data for us. So cool. Let's actually do a quick test. So what I can do, it's good to test your code as you go. So I'm going to paste that outline into mu. And then we can copy this function just to kind of test if it is working right. So load question answers. And from main, let me just call load question answers, and let's give it the name questions.text. And then, so that will return that, QA, right, because it's going to return a dictionary. So if I want to save a reference to it, I have to assign it to a variable. And then let's just print out QA and see if it has loaded in the data. Let's see, def ask question. Oh, so I need to pass and pass. All right, so it did indeed load questions. So for example, what are the names of the variables defined within the parentheses at a function definition? And then it maps to the answer parameters. And so it has loaded in at least that question, but presumably the other questions as well, into the dictionary. So off to a decent start, right? So let's move on to the next function. The next function will be getRandomQuestion. So this function is going to be passed in the QA dictionary, and this is actually going to be called from our ask question function eventually. But what this function should do is it should get that QA, and basically this function's job is to somehow randomly choose a question from this dictionary. So that would be a string, and then return that question. So it shouldn't just always return the same value. It should be based on something that is random. So one way you can do this if you have a dictionary and if you want to get one of the random values of the keys is you can grab all the keys, but you can put those keys into a list. So if you have all the keys in a list, then you can generate a random index using the random module, pick whatever string is at that index, and then return that string from this function. So how would you implement this in actual Python code? All right, so one way to do that, and this is one kind of short way that we can get all the keys into a list. We could actually loop through the dictionary and get all the keys, but a nice short way of doing it is if you say qa.keys, that will give you the keys, and then we convert it to a list so that we then have that list. So once we have that, we need to follow these other steps to get one of the questions at random. And so if we get a random number that's between 0 and the length of our list -1, so that it's a valid index. And then we get whatever question is at that index on that line, and then we just return that value. So this will get us a random question from our question-answer dictionary. All right, next one. So asking a question. So what we need to do is we need to, in this function, get a random question. So in other words, call this function that we already wrote. And then we need to print out that question, ask that question to the user. That's just a matter of printing it out. And then we need to ask the user to type in an answer. And then basically we're going to want some kind of if or if else to check, hey, if the user got it right, let's print out and tell the user you're correct. And let's return true. And then if you got the question wrong, say, hey, that was wrong, return false. Another thing you can do in this one as well is you can actually, if a user gets a question right, maybe we should say, well, let's not ask the user that question again. So you can actually go ahead and remove that question from the dictionary. So anyway, go ahead and think, how would you implement this function? And I think I actually have, I have some starter code. So we call the getRandomQuestion, we print out that question, and we wait for the user response. So what would you do specifically for kind of the if-else to handle whether the question was right or wrong? So to handle if the question is right or wrong, we need to be able to basically check that response that the user typed in, is that actually the right answer? Well, how do you get the right answer? You have to look up in your dictionary, take your question, and look that up and say, give me the value that's associated with this question, right? Remember, dictionaries have this kind of associativity or this mapping structure. So the way that we can get that is the following, where basically this gives us, in our QA dictionary, pass in the question and give me the value that's associated with that question, which would be the answer to that question. And so if my response is the same as the correct answer, I'll print out correct. I will go ahead and delete the question from the dictionary so that I don't ask that same question again. And then we will return true. And then if it's wrong, we say incorrect, return false. And we still leave the question in there because maybe if the user got it wrong, maybe that means we need to ask the user that question again to see if he can get it right, So we have this function now implemented too. And let's go to, I think I have, so we have our load questions and answers, get random question, and ask question functions. And of course, it would be good to have comments in these as well, but that's something that, if you were really concerned about that, you can, there are comments for these questions, although the comments that I have are a little bit more like describing what it should do. They're not really complete comments documenting or I guess it is, right? It documents like the parameters and stuff too, right? But I do already have comments. They're just not on this combo slide that I'm showing you right now. So the last step is to implement main. And basically main's job, it should kind of be the general outline of the program. So main is probably going to call load questions and answers to get the questions. And then it's probably going to have some kind of loop that repeatedly asks, or it first asks the user for how many questions. That would actually be the first. Then it loads the questions. And then basically a loop that for however many questions there were, call this function, keep track of how many of the answers were correct, and then at the end print out the score for the user. So how would we implement this? Well, I want you to think about it. How would we implement main? All right, so based on that outline, hopefully you had a chance to think about it. So this is a way that we could do it. We want to ask the user how many questions, convert that to an int. We could, of course, do the fancier check, is it numeric, and validate the input. But for now, we can just convert it to an int. And then ask for the file name, load in those questions. And then basically this loop in this zone is repeatedly asking the user a question, but it's also keeping track of the number of correct answers. So in that loop, we call the ask question function and pass in the dictionary to it. But then we also check after the question was asked if that correct variable that it returned was true, which is just if correct, that will be true if the variable is true. Then we add 1 to our correct count. And we're going to need our correct count later to determine, it'll tell how many we got correct out of the total number of questions variable. And then this basically is the calculation that gives us the grade as a percentage to print out to the user, and then the quiz is over and we can return, or just the main function can finish. So our final result, minus good commenting and stuff, is basically this, right? Those 4 functions and so on. And we have the bringing in the random module and the call to main, of course. So let's test this out. Let me bring in that code and this code. And then, oops, copy, paste, there we go. So I have my questions file there. So let's do a simulation where we do 4 questions, and the QA file is questions.txt. So what symbol is used for multiplication in Python? Well, that would be that symbol, right? So it says correct, great. What data structure stores things in a sequence? That would probably be a list. Let's see, true or false? Strings are immutable. So immutable means it cannot change after you've created it, and that is the case for strings. So let's say true, so it's correct. And what type can be used to store a number without decimals? So that would probably be an int or an integer. The question is, am I expecting int or integer? Let's say int. Hopefully that's right. So it says correct. It says I got 4 out of 4 correct, and I got a 100%. Let's also do a test with another file. Let's do the test with the this data. So new, let's say questions 2, replace it. So let's try this one, and let's just do a 2-question quiz, questions2.text. So what is the term length year for POTUS? POTUS stands for President of the United States, so that would be 4. And what color does the sky appear to most people? Blue. And there we go, 100%. And I guess another thing that I could try is, so let's go back and let's use questions again, because we need to do a test where the grade is not 100%. Oh, whoops. Oh, so let's go with 4, and let's say questions.text. So let's try one where I get a 25%. So let's get one question correct, what symbols used for string concatenation, plus, but then let's get the rest of them wrong, right? So I'll just say 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so I got 1 out of 4 correct, which gave me a 25%. So the quiz seems to be working. Now, one thing it might not handle the best, we could try and test this out, is let me go to put 4, or no, we'll use questions 2. Now we'll use questions. So, okay, I need to run this file. So if I say questions.text, oh no, I need to give the number first. So what if I give the number 20, and the QA file is questions.txt. So concatenation, so let's go through this and answer questions. So plus, multiplication star, duplicate keys, false or true, no, that's false. Sequence, list, true, true, input, let's keep going, what are the names of the variables? Parameters, number without decimals, int. 2 types of loops are for loop and while loop. Okay, so we eventually reached an error, and probably the reason why this happened is because I had said at the beginning of this particular run to ask 20 questions, and questions.text did not have 20 questions in it, since I was deleting the questions after I got the question correct, eventually it ran out of questions to ask, and we got an empty for the random range. We were out of questions to get a random index for. So that is one flaw with this program. So we could change it to not remove the questions after we've asked one. That would be one way to fix it. Or we could fix it to just check and say basically at some point we could, like in this loop, for example, I could say, after I've asked a question, I could say if the length of the questions, let's see, question answer dictionary is 0, then we could, or let's see, we could, so technically I told you guys you shouldn't be using break in general for this class, but because we're using a for loop for this one and not a while loop, I think break would actually probably make the most sense. Let's see, or I could, because of the for loop, we kind of have to use break, so we'll make an exception for this one, right? But you could say that to basically break out of the loop, and then you could go ahead and still print out the grade. I won't run it and test it right now. But anyway, hopefully that example was helpful to kind of show you a practical application for using dictionaries, right? One example of where you could use it is kind of having this mapping between questions and answers, right? That's what dictionaries, one of the things they're really good for is when you have some kind of associativity. For example, questions have answers, right? So if you have an associative kind of mapping like that, a one-to-one mapping, let's see. So, well, there's different kinds of mappings that it can represent. Because keys have to be unique, you may want to consider using something different than a dictionary if you have a one-to-many mapping, but if you have a many-to-one mapping or a one-to-one mapping, then that can work out all right. So anyway, hopefully that helps. Let us know if you have any questions about that example or what I showed, and otherwise, talk to you in the next video.